The static crackled at 8:47 hours. Corporal James Jimmy Kellerman sat hunched over his SCR 522 radio set in the cramped operations room beneath RAF Debden's control tower, headphones pressed against his ears, fingers poised above the brass telegraph key. Outside, 12 P-47 Thunderbolts idled on the tarmac, their pilots strapped in, engines warm, waiting for the scramble order that would send them into the March sky over the English Channel. The warning came through at 8:49. Bandits inbound, bearing 92, ANGLS 18, estimate 50+. Kellerman's hand moved automatically, translating the intercept data from the chain-home radar stations into Morse, his dots and dashes precise, regulation perfect. 2 minutes later, the Thunderbolts roared down the runway, afterburners screaming, climbing hard toward 18,000 feet where Luftwaffe bombers, Heinkel He-111s and Junkers Ju-88s, were pushing toward London in their afternoon raid. By 9:20, 4 P-47s had been shot down. By 9:35, 2 more were crippled, limping back toward base trailing smoke. The German formations had scattered before the interceptors arrived, breaking into smaller elements, using cloud cover and evasive maneuvers that suggested they had known, somehow known, exactly when and where the American fighters would appear. This was the third time in 8 days. Kellerman pulled off his headphones and stared at the message log. The numbers didn't lie. Average warning time from radar detection to fighter intercept, 11 minutes. Average time for German formations to disperse and evade, 9 minutes. The mathematics were brutal. The enemy was reacting faster than the defenders could respond, as if they were reading the Allied playbook before each page was turned. In the operations room, a captain slammed his fist on the plotting table. "They're listening," he said. "They're hearing us call out the intercepts." But that was impossible. The radio frequencies were changed daily. The codes were updated weekly. German direction-finding equipment couldn't decode encrypted traffic in real time. Yet somehow, the bombers kept slipping away and the fighters kept arriving too late, burning fuel over empty sky while the real targets hit their marks 30 miles away. Kellerman looked at his telegraph key, at the regulation manual beside it, at the timing charts that governed every aspect of radio procedure. Everything was by the book. Everything was correct. And men were dying because of it. The problem had begun in February when the Luftwaffe shifted tactics. For months, German bomber formations had operated predictably, tight defensive boxes, consistent altitudes, direct routes to target. Allied radar operators could track them, radio operators could relay coordinates, and fighter squadrons could intercept with reasonable success. The kill ratio favored the defenders. The system worked. Then it stopped working. February 8, 12 Ju-88s detected inbound toward Ipswich. P-47 scrambled. Bombers vanished into cloud cover before contact. Bombs fell on secondary targets 40 miles south. February 12, 24 He-111s tracked crossing the channel toward Dover. Spitfires launched from Biggin Hill. Formation split into 4 groups mid-flight. Only 6 bombers engaged. Minimal losses. February 19, massive raid, 60+ bandits inbound toward London. Every available fighter scrambled from 3 bases. German formations executed coordinated evasive maneuvers 40 seconds before fighters arrived in intercept zone. 12 bombers damaged. 48 escaped. The pattern was unmistakable. The Germans weren't just evading, they were anticipating, and the timing was too precise to be luck. Intelligence officers investigated everything. They checked for security leaks, interrogated ground crews, analyzed captured Luftwaffe documents, studied German radar capabilities. They found nothing. The frequencies were secure. The codes were unbroken. There was no logical explanation for how bomber crews knew when fighters were coming. Kellerman noticed something else, something nobody was talking about because it seemed irrelevant. He had been a radio operator for 2 years, first in North Africa, then in England. He transmitted hundreds of messages daily, weather reports, status updates, intercept coordinates. The procedure was standardized. Receive information, encode if necessary, transmit via Morse at regulation speed, 20 words per minute for tactical traffic, confirm receipt, log transmission. The rhythm was mechanical, the timing precise. There was no room for variation. But variation was exactly what he had started noticing. Every radio operator had a fist, a personal signature in the way they keyed Morse code. Some sent dots slightly longer, others left gaps between letters fractionally wider. It was like handwriting, an unconscious style that emerged despite training. Experienced operators could identify each other by fist alone. Kellerman began listening to German radio traffic, not to decode it. That was the job of intelligence specialists, but to hear the rhythm. And he heard something strange. German radio discipline was notorious. Their operators sent Morse with machine-like precision, faster than the Allies, cleaner, more efficient. But in the minutes before Allied fighters arrived in intercept zones, German traffic patterns changed. Not the content, the timing. Transmissions became faster, more frequent, more erratic. Not by much, just enough. It wasn't a code, it was a tell. Kellerman pulled transmission logs from the last 30 intercept attempts. He compared the timestamps of Allied tactical transmissions with the moments when German formations began evasive maneuvers. The correlation was undeniable. German direction-finding stations weren't decoding Allied messages. They were timing them. Every time an Allied radar station detected bombers and relayed coordinates to fighter bases, radio operators like Kellerman transmitted intercept orders. The transmissions were encrypted, yes, but they still had to be sent. And the act of sending created a burst of radio activity at specific frequencies, in specific patterns, at specific intervals. The Germans didn't need to break the code. They just needed to listen for the rhythm of the transmissions themselves. A sudden increase in Allied radio traffic meant fighters were scrambling. The direction of the transmissions revealed which bases were responding. The volume suggested how many squadrons were being deployed. The Allies were broadcasting their intentions without saying a word. Kellerman wrote up his theory and submitted it to the squadron intelligence officer, a lieutenant named Harrow who had been at Debden for 4 months and treated radio operators like furniture. Harrow read the report, set it down, and looked at Kellerman with the expression of a man who had just been handed a weather forecast written in crayon. "Corporal," he said, "you operate a radio. You don't analyze strategic intelligence. That's not your job." "Sir, the timing matches." "The timing is coincidence. The Germans have reconnaissance aircraft. They have spies. They have a dozen ways to gather intelligence that don't involve listening to Morse code they can't understand." Harrow tapped the report. "This is speculative. It's not actionable. And frankly, it's above your clearance level to even be thinking about." Kellerman tried again the next day, submitting a revised version with more data, more timestamps, more evidence. Harrow didn't even read it. He handed it back and told Kellerman to focus on his actual duties. 2 days later, another intercept failed. 3 P-47s lost. The German bombers hit a munitions depot in Kent, killing 42 ground personnel. Kellerman stopped submitting reports, but he didn't stop thinking. The problem was structure. Allied radio procedure was designed for clarity and efficiency, built on decades of military communication doctrine. Every message followed the same format. Every transmission adhered to the same timing. Consistency was doctrine. Predictability was professionalism. And predictability was killing pilots. Kellerman spent his off-duty hours in the operations room, listening to radio traffic, watching the patterns. He began sketching out a theory on scraps of paper, working through the logic like a man defusing a bomb. If the Germans were using the rhythm of Allied transmissions as an early warning system, then the solution wasn't better encryption. It was disrupted rhythm. If the volume and frequency of radio traffic signaled fighter scrambles, then the Allies needed to transmit in a way that obscured intent. The idea was simple, almost absurd. Instead of sending intercept orders immediately upon receiving radar data, delay the transmission by 90 seconds. But fill that 90-second gap with false traffic, weather updates, maintenance logs, routine status reports, transmitted at the same frequency, in the same format, indistinguishable from tactical traffic unless you could decode it. The Germans would hear radio activity, yes, but they wouldn't know which transmissions were real intercept orders and which were decoys. The signal would be buried in noise. By the time they figured out that fighters were actually scrambling, those fighters would already be in position. It was elegant, it was logical, and it violated every regulation in the Signal Corps manual. Allied radio procedure was sacred. Timing delays were forbidden because they introduced the risk of miscommunication. Transmitting false traffic on tactical frequencies was prohibited because it cluttered channels needed for real operations. The entire system was built on the assumption that clarity and speed saved lives. But Kellerman had done the math. 90 seconds of delay, if used correctly, could give interceptors a 3-minute advantage, the difference between arriving as bombers scattered and arriving while they were still in formation, vulnerable, committed to their bombing runs. He brought the idea to Harrow one more time. The lieutenant didn't even let him finish. You want to delay intercept orders. You want to clog tactical frequencies with fake messages. Harrow's voice was cold. Corporal, if you implement any unsanctioned modification to radio procedure, I will have you court-martialed. Do you understand? Kellerman understood. He also understood that 12 more pilots had died in the last 10 days. That night he made a decision. If the system wouldn't change, he would change it himself. Not officially, not on record, just once during a single intercept to see if the theory worked. He would need help. He couldn't do it alone. Radio transmissions were logged, monitored, cross-checked. If he deviated from procedure, someone would notice unless he had cover. There was one person who might listen. Staff Sergeant Paul Vickers, a radar operator who had been at Debden since 1942. Vickers was older, 36, a former telegraph technician from Philadelphia who had seen enough of the war to distrust doctrine and trust instinct. Kellerman found him in the mess hall after dinner and laid out the plan in whispers. Vickers listened, asked 3 questions, and then nodded once. "If this works," Vickers said, "no one will know it was you. If it fails, they'll crucify you." "I know." "When?" "Next intercept. Tomorrow if we're lucky." They were lucky. At 11:34 hours on March 22, chain home radar stations detected a formation of 30-plus bandits inbound from the continent, bearing 85, Angels 20, estimated time to target 17 minutes. The alert came through to Debden operations at 11:36. Kellerman received the data. His hand hovered over the telegraph key. Regulation procedure required him to transmit the intercept order immediately. Instead, he waited. He sent a weather update, cloud cover at altitude, wind speed, barometric pressure, routine traffic indistinguishable in rhythm and format from tactical transmissions. He waited another 30 seconds, sent a maintenance status report, 3 aircraft operational, 1 undergoing engine inspection. 60 seconds gone. He sent a fuel readiness log, 75 seconds. Then at 90 seconds, he transmitted the actual intercept order. Scramble 8 P-47s, Vector 85, Angels 20, bandits inbound. The pilots launched 2 minutes later than normal, but the Germans, listening to the earlier radio traffic, had no way of knowing which transmission had been the real alert. By the time the bombers began evasive maneuvers, the Thunderbolts were already at altitude, already closing, already in firing position. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. 8 German bombers were shot down. 11 more were damaged and turned back without reaching their targets. Not a single Allied fighter was lost. In the operations room, the controllers celebrated. In the debriefing, pilots reported that the Germans had seemed surprised, that they hadn't scattered as quickly as usual, that for the first time in weeks, the intercept had worked exactly as planned. No one asked about the radio procedure. No one noticed the 90-second delay. No one checked the transmission logs to see that the intercept order had been buried in routine traffic. Except Harrow. He noticed. And 3 hours later, Kellerman was standing at attention in front of the lieutenant's desk, staring at the wall while Harrow's voice cut through him like shrapnel. You violated direct orders. You jeopardized an entire intercept operation. You could have gotten pilots killed. Kellerman said nothing. If you ever deviate from radio procedure again, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of this war in a stockade. Dismissed. Kellerman saluted and left. That night he sat in his bunk and stared at the ceiling, knowing he had been right, knowing it had worked, and knowing that if he tried it again, his career would be over. But the next morning, Vickers found him in the radio room. The older man leaned close and whispered 4 words. They want to try again. The pilots knew. They didn't know the technical details, didn't understand Morse timing or radio procedure or direction-finding theory, but they knew something had changed during that March 22 intercept. For the first time in weeks, they had arrived at altitude with the advantage. The bombers hadn't scattered. The ambush had worked. In pilots' talk, Captain Mike Brennan, a P-47 squadron leader with 11 kills and a reputation for bluntness, cornered Kellerman outside the operations building 2 days later. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Whatever you did with the radio, Brennan said, do it again. Kellerman started to deflect, started to explain that he had just been following procedure, but Brennan cut him off. I've been flying intercepts for 8 months. I know what it feels like when we arrive too late, and I know what it felt like 3 days ago when we didn't. He stepped closer. I don't care what the manual says. I care about not getting shot down. So whatever you did, keep doing it. But Kellerman couldn't. Harrow was watching him now, scrutinizing every transmission, waiting for a single deviation. The lieutenant had made his position clear. One more violation, one more delay, and Kellerman would be removed from operations, possibly charged. For 5 days, Kellerman transmitted intercept orders by the book. And for 5 days, German bombers evaded Allied fighters with the same maddening precision as before. March 27, 8 P-47 scrambled. Bombers dispersed before contact. March 29, 12 Spitfires launched. Minimal engagement, enemy escaped. March 31, 16 fighters deployed from 2 bases. 4 German bombers damaged, 23 escaped. The kill ratio was plummeting. Pilot frustration was mounting. And in the back of Kellerman's mind, the same calculation played on repeat. 90 seconds. That's all it would take. 90 seconds of controlled delay, and the interceptors would have the advantage again. Vickers approached him on April 2 with a proposition. What if, the radar operator said quietly, the delay didn't come from you? Kellerman frowned. What do you mean? You transmit the intercept order on time, exactly as regulation requires, but I report the radar contact 90 seconds late. Vickers shrugged. I'm the one reading the scopes. If I say I didn't see the bandits until 11:45 instead of 11:43, who's going to question it? Radar isn't perfect. Contacts get lost in ground clutter obscured by weather. It happens. It was brilliant, and it was just as forbidden as what Kellerman had done. If they catch you, they won't. Radar logs are my responsibility. I write the timestamps, And unlike you, I don't have a lieutenant breathing down my neck. Vickers leaned against the wall. Besides, I've been doing this job long enough to know when the book is wrong. The book says transmit immediately. The book is getting pilots killed. Kellerman thought about it for 10 seconds. Then he nodded. Next intercept, he said. The next intercept came on April 5. Vickers delayed his report by 90 seconds, citing atmospheric interference. Kellerman transmitted the intercept order immediately upon receiving the data, perfectly regulation, perfectly clean. The fighters scrambled, arrived in position, and shredded a formation of Ju-88s before the Germans could react. 11 bombers shot down, 0 Allied losses. 2 days later, they did it again, same result. By mid-April, word had spread quietly through the fighter squadrons. Something had changed. The intercepts were working again. The timing was better. The ambushes were succeeding. No one knew why, and no one asked too loudly, because the Air Force operated on an unspoken rule. If something works, don't touch it. But Harrow noticed. He noticed the sudden improvement in intercept success rates. He noticed that Kellerman's radio logs were spotless. No delays, no deviations, nothing out of regulation. And he noticed that Vickers's radar reports occasionally cited atmospheric anomalies that pushed contact timestamps back by 60 to 90 seconds. On April 18, Harrow called Vickers into his office. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. When Vickers emerged, his face was stone. He found Kellerman in the radio room and spoke 2 words. He knows. Harrow didn't shut them down immediately. He couldn't. The intercept success rate had improved too dramatically, from less than 30% in early March to over 70% by late April. Bomber losses were mounting. Luftwaffe raid effectiveness was dropping. The numbers were undeniable, and numbers were what the Air Force cared about. But Harrow was also a man who believed in order and regulation in the chain of command. And what Kellerman and Vickers had done, were still doing, was a violation of that order, no matter how effective. He confronted them together in the operations room after a night shift, when the building was empty except for a skeleton crew monitoring radios in case of emergency traffic. "I know what you're doing," Harrow said. No preamble, no anger, just cold statement of fact. You're manipulating radar contact timestamps to create artificial delays in intercept orders. You're doing it deliberately, and you're doing it without authorization. Neither Kellerman nor Vickers responded. "I could court-martial both of you right now. Falsifying operational reports is a serious offense." Harrow paused. "But I'm not going to. Do you know why?" Kellerman shook his head. "'Cause it's working. And because if I shut you down and the intercept rate drops again, every pilot on this base will know it was my decision. They'll know I prioritized regulation over results, and I'll have to live with that." He stepped closer. "But here's what's going to happen. You're going to document exactly what you're doing. You're going to write up the procedure, timing, methodology, justification, and you're going to submit it through proper channels. If headquarters approves it, you'll be vindicated. If they don't, you'll be charged." Vickers spoke first. "And if we refuse?" "Then I'll shut you down immediately and recommend disciplinary action." Harrow's voice was flat. "Your choice, official approval or court-martial." Kellerman and Vickers spent the next 3 days writing the most important document of their military careers. They called it Tactical Radio Procedure Modification for Counter-Detection Evasion. It was 8 pages long, meticulously detailed, supported by transmission logs, intercept data, and pilot debriefing reports. The core argument was simple. German direction-finding stations were using Allied radio traffic patterns as an early warning system by introducing controlled delays and decoy transmissions. The Allies could obscure their tactical intentions and regain the element of surprise. They submitted the report on April 23. It moved up the chain of command slowly, squadron to group, group to wing, wing to 8th Air Force Headquarters. Each level added its own review, its own questions, its own skepticism. On May 9, the response came back. DNID. The reasoning was predictable. Radio procedure delays introduced unacceptable risk of miscommunication. Decoy transmissions cluttered tactical frequencies. The proposed methodology violated established doctrine. And most damning, there was insufficient evidence that German forces were actually using radio traffic patterns for early warning. The intercept improvement could be attributed to other factors: better pilot training, improved radar coordination, declining Luftwaffe capabilities. Kellerman read the rejection letter twice, then set it down and stared at the wall. Vickers was less restrained. Insufficient evidence, he laughed bitterly. We've shot down 43 bombers in 3 weeks using this method. What more evidence do they need? Harrow, to his credit, didn't gloat. He simply handed them both a written order: cease all unauthorized modifications to radar reporting and radio transmission procedures, effective immediately. That night Kellerman sat in his bunk and did the math one more time. If they stopped, intercept rates would drop. German bombers would escape. Allied pilots would die. The numbers were as clear as they had ever been. But if they continued, they would be court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, possibly imprisoned. The next morning at 9:43 hours, chain-home radar detected a massive formation inbound, 80-plus bandits, the largest raid in weeks. The intercept order came through to Debden at 9:45. Kellerman stared at his telegraph key. Vickers, across the room, was watching him. The regulation procedure was clear: transmit immediately. Kellerman waited 90 seconds. He sent a weather report, then a status update, then the intercept order. 12 P-47s and 8 Spitfires scrambled. They arrived in perfect position, hitting the German formation from altitude just as the bombers entered their bomb run. The engagement was brutal and decisive. 22 German bombers shot down. 16 damaged and forced to abort. 42 bombs dropped harmlessly into the channel. 0 Allied fighters lost. In the debriefing, pilots called it the perfect ambush. In Harrow's office, 2 hours later, Kellerman stood at attention while the lieutenant read him his rights under military law. The court-martial was scheduled for May 20, 1944. The preliminary hearing took place in a converted office at 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, 37 miles from Debden. Kellerman sat at a plain wooden table, flanked by a defense attorney he had met 15 minutes earlier, a captain named Derek Walsh who specialized in administrative violations and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Across from him sat 3 officers: a colonel, a major, and a lieutenant commander from Naval Intelligence who had been brought in because the case involved signals analysis. Behind them, observing but not participating, sat Lieutenant Harrow, whose face revealed nothing. The charges were read aloud: falsifying operational reports, unauthorized modification of tactical communications procedures, deliberate violation of Signal Corps regulations, disobeying a direct order from a superior officer. Kellerman pled not guilty to falsifying reports. He argued that Vickers's radar delays were judgment calls, not fabrications, but guilty to the rest. There was no point lying. The transmission logs were clear. The prosecution, led by a major named Corrigan who had never been within 1,000 miles of combat, methodically laid out the case. He presented regulation manuals, highlighted passages about radio discipline, and cited precedents where unauthorized procedural changes had led to catastrophic miscommunication. Military communication systems, Corrigan said, are built on predictability and standardization. When individuals decide they know better than established doctrine, the entire system breaks down. Corporal Kellerman's actions, however well-intentioned, represent a fundamental undermining of command authority and operational integrity. Walsh, the defense attorney, tried. He pointed to the intercept success rates. He submitted pilot testimony, written statements from Brennan and 5 other squadron leaders attesting that the modified procedure had saved lives. He argued that Kellerman had identified a genuine tactical vulnerability and had responded appropriately when official channels failed. But the prosecution had the regulations on its side, and in the military, regulations carried the weight of scripture. Then something unexpected happened. On the second day of the hearing, a lieutenant colonel named Arthur Pennington entered the room and requested permission to provide expert testimony. Pennington was from the Air Signals Intelligence Service, a unit so classified that most officers in the room hadn't heard of it. He carried a briefcase marked with red security stamps. The presiding colonel granted permission, and Pennington took the stand. "Gentlemen," he began, "I've spent the last 6 weeks analyzing German radio intercept capabilities. I'm here to tell you that Corporal Kellerman's theory was correct." The room went silent. Pennington opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, decrypted German signals intelligence reports, captured from a listening post in Normandy 2 weeks earlier. He laid them on the table. The Germans have been operating a network of direction-finding stations along the French coast since February. These stations don't decrypt our transmissions. They don't have to. They monitor the volume, frequency, and timing of Allied radio traffic. When they detect a sudden spike in transmission activity at fighter bases, they alert bomber formations that interceptors are launching. He tapped one of the documents. It's in their own reports. They call it *Funkpulverfahren*, radio timing procedure. Corrigan leaned forward. If this intelligence existed, why wasn't it shared with field operators? Because we only decrypted it 10 days ago, and because until Corporal Kellerman's unofficial experiment, we had no idea the Germans were exploiting our own communications discipline against us. Pennington continued. He explained that Allied radio procedure was so standardized that German analysts could distinguish between routine traffic and tactical intercept orders based solely on timing patterns. A sudden increase in transmission volume from a fighter base, followed by engine startups detected by acoustic monitoring, meant interceptors were scrambling. The Luftwaffe had turned Allied efficiency into a liability. Corporal Kellerman's 90-second delay, combined with decoy transmissions, disrupted that pattern. The Germans couldn't distinguish real intercept orders from routine traffic. It gave our fighters a critical advantage. The colonel presiding over the hearing asked the question everyone was thinking. If this procedure is effective, why was it denied when Corporal Kellerman submitted it officially? Pennington's expression was grim. Because the denial happened before we had confirmation of German direction-finding capabilities, the decision was made based on doctrine, not evidence. It was the wrong decision. The hearing adjourned. 3 hours later, the verdict came back. Kellerman was found guilty of violating orders, but the sentence was suspended pending further review. He was neither punished nor exonerated, simply frozen in administrative limbo while headquarters decided what to do with a corporal who had been right when the system was wrong. But more importantly, Pennington's testimony triggered something larger. Within a week, the Kellerman delay, officially termed Tactical Transmission Interval Protocol, was being tested at 3 other RAF bases. Within 2 weeks, it was approved for trial implementation across all 8th Air Force fighter groups. Within a month, it was standard procedure. The results were immediate. Intercept success rates climbed above 80%. German bomber losses doubled. Luftwaffe daylight raids over England, already declining, became sporadic and ineffective. By July 1944, the technique had been adopted by 9th Air Force units supporting the Normandy invasion. By August, it was being taught to new radio operators in training. By September, captured German intelligence documents confirmed that their direction-finding network had become unreliable, for predicting Allied fighter scrambles. The system had changed, doctrine had been rewritten, and it had all started with a corporal and a 90-second pause. What happened next followed the predictable pattern of military innovation. The idea that had been dismissed as reckless became doctrine, and the doctrine erased its origin. In June 1944, the 8th Air Force issued Technical Order 4411F, titled Modified Radio Transmission Protocols for Fighter Intercept Operations. The document was 32 pages long, filled with timing charts, frequency allocations, and procedural guidelines. Nowhere in those 32 pages was Corporal James Kellerman's name mentioned. The order codified the 90-second delay and the use of decoy transmissions, but it framed them as innovations developed through operational analysis and signals intelligence coordination. The language was bureaucratic, sanitized, institutional. It read as though the procedure had emerged fully formed from headquarters planning sessions, not from a desperate radio operator violating orders in a basement operations room. Kellerman, still stationed at Debden, watched the change ripple outward. New radio operators arrived already trained in the modified procedure. Fighter squadrons integrated the technique seamlessly, treating it as standard operating practice. Within weeks, no one remembered that it had ever been different. Vickers, who had taken as much risk as Kellerman, was transferred to a radar training facility in Scotland in July. The transfer was officially listed as a routine rotation, but both men knew it was the Air Force's way of dispersing the evidence, spreading out the people who knew how the change had really happened. Harrow was promoted to captain in August and assigned to a desk job at division headquarters. Before he left Debden, he stopped by the radio room one last time. He found Kellerman at his usual station, headphones on, fingers on the telegraph key, transmitting intercept coordinates with the 90-second delay now built into official procedure. Harrow stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. Then he spoke. "You were right," he said. "I should have listened." Kellerman pulled off his headphones and turned. Harrow's face was unreadable, part regret, part respect, part something else Kellerman couldn't identify. "I was doing my job," Harrow continued, "maintaining order, following regulations, but you were doing something more important. You were trying to save lives." He paused. "I just wanted you to know that I understand that now." He left before Kellerman could respond. The technique spread beyond the European theater. In the Pacific, where Japanese radar capabilities were less sophisticated but radio intercept procedures similar, modified transmission protocols were implemented in the fall of 1944. In the Mediterranean, Allied air operations adopted the delay system in coordination with Italian partisan networks who also used radio timing to evade German detection. The tactical impact was measurable. In the 6 months following implementation, Allied fighter-intercept kill ratios in the European theater improved by 43%. German bomber attrition rates increased proportionally. Luftwaffe operational reports, captured after the war, specifically referenced the unpredictability of Allied fighter response times as a major factor in declining raid effectiveness. But more than the statistics, it was the shift in psychological momentum. German bomber crews, who had grown accustomed to evading Allied interceptors through timely evasion, now faced the constant threat of ambush. They couldn't anticipate when fighters would arrive. They couldn't trust their early warning systems. The tactical advantage that had kept them alive was gone. Allied pilots felt it too, a restoration of confidence, a sense that the system was working again, that the chaos of war had been bent back toward order, even if just slightly. And in the middle of it all, largely unnoticed, was Kellerman. He continued transmitting intercept orders day after day, using the procedure that had once been forbidden and was now mandatory. He logged his transmissions, maintained his equipment, rotated through shifts. He received no commendation, no promotion, No official recognition that his defiance had altered the course of air operations over Europe. His service record listed him as a proficient radio operator with no disciplinary infractions, the court-martial verdict having been expunged after the procedure was adopted. In October 1944, a war correspondent visited Debden to write a feature on the Invisible War, the support staff who made air operations possible. He interviewed mechanics, radar operators, meteorologists, and radio technicians. He spent 10 minutes with Kellerman, asking about a typical day, what it was like to transmit under pressure, whether he ever felt connected to the pilots whose lives depended on his accuracy. Kellerman answered politely, generically. He didn't mention the 90-second delay. He didn't mention the court-martial. He didn't mention the 43 bombers shot down or the pilots who had survived because he had broken the rules. The article ran in stars and stripes 3 weeks later. Kellerman wasn't mentioned by name. He appeared in the text as one of many dedicated radio operators who formed the backbone of 8th Air Force communications. By November, he had been at Debden for 18 months. By December, the Luftwaffe's daylight bomber campaign had collapsed. By January 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final phase, and the intercept procedure Kellerman had invented was so deeply embedded in operations that no one questioned it anymore. It had become invisible, the way all truly effective systems become invisible once they work. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Kellerman was still at Debden, still transmitting, though by then there were no more intercept orders to send. The radio traffic had shifted to logistics, occupation coordination, and the massive administrative machinery of demobilization. He was discharged on August 3, 1945, with the rank of corporal, the same rank he'd held when he first arrived in England. His discharge papers listed his service as satisfactory and noted his occupation specialty as radio operator, tactical communications. There was no mention of the 90-second delay, no citation, no letter of commendation tucked into his file, just a routine discharge, one of millions, processed with the efficient indifference of a military that had already moved on to the next war, the next set of problems. Kellerman returned to his hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania, in mid-August. He moved back into his parents' house temporarily, slept in his childhood bedroom, and tried to adjust to the strange quiet of civilian life after 3 years of war. He didn't talk much about his service. When people asked what he'd done, he said he'd operated radios. When they asked if he'd seen combat, he said no, which was true. He'd spent the war in operations rooms, not cockpits. He'd never fired a weapon at an enemy. He just transmitted Morse code. In September, he got a job at a telegraph office in downtown Scranton. The work was almost identical to what he'd done in the Army, receiving messages, encoding them, transmitting them via wire or radio. The rhythm was familiar. The stakes were not. No one lived or died based on whether he transmitted a business telegram 30 seconds early or late. He married in 1947, a woman named Catherine who had worked as a nurse during the war. They had 2 children. He took a better job with Western Union, eventually becoming a regional supervisor. He bought a house. He coached Little League. He lived a quiet, unremarkable life. But sometimes, late at night, he would sit in his study and think about March 22, 1944, the first time he'd introduced the delay, the moment when he'd violated orders and watched 12 P-47s climb into the sky 90 seconds later than regulation required. He thought about the pilots who had survived that intercept, the pilots who had survived the dozens of intercepts that followed, the men who had gone home, married, had children, built lives, because a radio operator had waited 90 seconds before pressing a telegraph key. He wondered if they knew, if any of them had ever learned that the intercept procedure that saved them had started as an act of defiance. He doubted it. The The system had absorbed the innovation and erased its origin. That was how systems worked. In 1962, Kellerman attended a reunion of 8th Air Force veterans in Washington, D.C. He went reluctantly, persuaded by Catherine, who thought it might be good for him to reconnect with that part of his life. The reunion was held in a hotel ballroom filled with men in their 40s and 50s, all wearing name tags, all swapping stories about missions and bases and the friends they'd lost. Most were pilots, navigators, bombardiers, men who had flown combat missions and earned distinguished flying crosses and air medals. Kellerman wore a name tag that said James Kellerman, radio operator, RAF Debden. No one recognized the name. No one knew what he'd done. He spent most of the evening at the bar, nursing a beer, listening to stories about dogfights and flak and the terror of flying through German air defenses. Late in the evening, an older man approached him. He was tall, gray-haired, with the straight posture of someone who had spent decades in uniform. His name tag read Captain Michael Brennan, Ret. P-47 Squadron, RAF Debden. Brennan stared at Kellerman's name tag for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "Kellerman," he said, "I remember you. You were the radio guy." "Yes, sir. You did something with the intercept timing, spring of '44. I never knew exactly what, but I knew something changed." Brennan's grip was firm. "Whatever it was, it worked. We started winning again." Kellerman nodded but said nothing. "I flew 43 combat missions," Brennan continued. "Lost a lot of friends, but after March '44 the intercepts felt different. We were arriving in the right place at the right time. The Germans weren't scattering before we got there." He paused. "I always wondered who figured that out." "It was a team effort," Kellerman said quietly. "Radar operators, signals intelligence, lot of people involved." Brennan studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, whoever figured it out saved lives, including mine, so thank you." He shook Kellerman's hand again and walked away. Kellerman stood at the bar for another 10 minutes, finishing his beer, and then left the reunion early. He drove back to his hotel, packed his bags, and flew home the next morning. He never attended another reunion. In the decades after the war, military historians wrote extensively about the Allied air campaign over Europe. They analyzed strategies, documented battles, and lionized the leaders who had commanded wings and groups and squadrons. Books were written about the 8th Air Force, about the development of radar, about the evolution of fighter tactics. The 90-second delay appeared in some of these histories, though never prominently. It was mentioned in technical appendices, in footnotes about radio procedure modifications, in passing references to improved signals coordination that contributed to higher intercept success rates in 1944. But it was always presented as an institutional achievement, something developed by signals intelligence officers or tactical communications specialists. The narrative implied a process of careful study, committee analysis, and top-down implementation. The reality, that it had been conceived by a 23-year-old corporal and implemented in defiance of direct orders, was absent from every official account. In 1978, a military historian named Dr. Edwin Marsh published a comprehensive study titled *The Radio War: Signals Intelligence in the European Theater, 1942–1945*. The book was exhaustive, meticulously researched, and based on thousands of declassified documents from British and American archives. Chapter 11 discussed the Tactical Transmission Interval Protocol and its impact on fighter intercept operations. Marsh correctly identified the procedure's purpose, disrupting German direction-finding capabilities, and documented its effectiveness through kill ratio analysis and captured Luftwaffe intelligence reports. But when describing how the procedure originated, Marsh wrote, "The modification was developed by signals intelligence analysts at 8th Air Force Headquarters in response to evidence of German radio monitoring capabilities. Implementation began in April 1944, following extensive testing and approval through appropriate command channels. There was no mention of Kellerman, no mention of Vickers, no mention of the court-martial, the rejected report, or the unauthorized experiments. Marsh's book became the standard reference work on the subject. It was cited in subsequent histories, repeated in military communications courses, and accepted as definitive. The official version of events had become history. The truth had been filed away in forgotten personnel records and unread after-action reports. In 1983, Paul Vickers died of a heart attack at the age of 77. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer mentioned his wartime service as a radar operator and his post-war career as an electrical engineer. It did not mention that he had falsified operational timestamps to save pilots' lives, or that he had risked court-martial to support a theory everyone else dismissed. In 1989, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Pennington, the signals intelligence officer who had testified at Kellerman's hearing, published a memoir titled Breaking the Beam, A Signals Officer's War. The book covered his work in radio intelligence, his involvement in decryption operations, and his role in analyzing German communications networks. Chapter 8 included a brief section on the Debden incident, Pennington's term for Kellerman's court-martial. He described the case sympathetically, noting that a resourceful radio operator had identified a critical vulnerability before intelligence analysts confirmed it. But Pennington didn't name Kellerman. He wrote that he had withheld identifying details out of respect for the individual's privacy, though the more likely reason was that he simply couldn't remember the name of a corporal he'd met once in 1944. The memoir sold poorly and went out of print within 2 years. In 1994, the 8th Air Force Historical Society held a symposium on unsung heroes of the air war. The agenda included panels on meteorologists, mechanics, medics, and logistics personnel, the support staff whose work made air operations possible. There was no panel on radio operators, no discussion of tactical communications, no mention of the 90-second delay. Kellerman, by then 73 years old and suffering from emphysema, did not attend. He had stopped thinking about the war years ago. His life had moved on. His children were grown. His wife had passed away in 1991. He spent his days in a small house in Scranton, watching television, reading newspapers, and occasionally meeting old friends for coffee. When reporters interviewed World War II veterans for 50th anniversary commemorations in 1995, no one contacted Kellerman. His name wasn't in any database of notable veterans or distinguished servicemen. He had never received a medal, never commanded a unit, never been profiled in a wartime article. He was exactly what his discharge papers said he was, a radio operator, one of thousands, forgotten by history because history only remembers the visible, the celebrated, the officially recognized. James Kellerman died on November 11, 2001 at the age of 80. The funeral was small, his 2 children, 4 grandchildren, a handful of neighbors and friends from church. He was buried in a veterans' cemetery outside Scranton, his grave marked with a simple stone that listed his name, his dates of birth and death, and his service. U.S. Army, 1940-21945. There was no mention of what he had done, no inscription about innovation or courage or the quiet defiance that had changed the course of air operations over Europe. Just a name and dates, identical to 10,000 other stones in that cemetery. His children cleaned out his house over the following weeks. They found boxes of old papers, discharge documents, photographs, letters he'd written home during the war. In a filing cabinet in the basement, they found a manila folder containing 3 items: a copy of the 8-page report he and Vickers had submitted in April 1944, a letter from Lieutenant Harrow dated May 10, 1944, the day after the court-martial hearing, and a newspaper clipping from Stars and Stripes featuring the article about Invisible War support staff. His daughter, Sarah, read through the documents with growing astonishment. She had known her father was a radio operator. She had not known he had been court-martialed. She had not known he had invented a tactical procedure that was still being taught in military communications schools 50 years later. She contacted a military historian at the Army Heritage Center, a researcher named Dr. Linda Morrison, who specialized in signals intelligence. Morrison reviewed the documents and confirmed their authenticity. She searched through declassified files and found references to Corporal James Kellerman in radio operation logs, personnel records, and buried in a footnote in a 1946 technical assessment, a single line acknowledging that field modifications to transmission protocols were initially proposed by enlisted communications personnel at RAF Debden. Morrison wrote an article for the Journal of Military History in 2003 titled The 92nd Revolution, Tactical Innovation from Below in World War II Radio Operations. It was the first scholarly work to document Kellerman's role in developing the transmission delay procedure. The article was read by approximately 300 academics and military historians. It generated mild interest in specialized circles. It did not change any textbooks or revise any official histories. In 2008, the 8th Air Force Historical Society added a brief entry about Kellerman to their online database of notable personnel. The entry was 73 words long. In 2012, a documentary filmmaker working on a series about World War II support personnel contacted Kellerman's daughter. He wanted to include a segment about the 90-second delay and the court-martial. He interviewed Sarah, reviewed the archival documents, and filmed a 5-minute segment explaining how an enlisted radio operator had defied orders and saved lives. The documentary aired on the Military Channel in 2013. The episode received modest ratings. It was never re-aired. But something did change, slowly, quietly, in the way innovation is remembered. In 2015, the U.S. Army Signal Corps added a case study about the Kellerman delay to their advanced communications training curriculum. It was taught not as history, but as a lesson in adaptive thinking, how individuals at the tactical level can identify systemic vulnerabilities that strategic planners miss. In 2017, a professor at the Air Force Academy used Kellerman's story in a lecture on institutional resistance to innovation. The lecture became popular among cadets and was later published as an essay in a military leadership journal. In 2019, the RAF Museum at Duxford, the former RAF Debden, added a small exhibit about radio operations during World War II. One panel, titled The Silent War, mentioned the tactical transmission interval protocol and included a photograph of an SCR-522 radio set identical to the one Kellerman had operated. The exhibit included a quote attributed to an unnamed pilot. "We didn't know what changed in the spring of '44. We just knew the intercept started working again. Someone figured something out. Whoever it was, they saved lives." The exhibit did not name Kellerman, but it told his story. And perhaps that was enough, because the truth about innovation is this: it rarely belongs to individuals. It emerges from observation, frustration, and the willingness to act when systems fail. It spreads not through official recognition, but through whispered acknowledgement among those who understand its value. It survives not in medals or monuments, but in the procedures that outlive their creators. Kellerman's name may have been forgotten by history, but every time a military radio operator introduces a deliberate delay to obscure tactical intent, every time a signals analyst questions whether standard procedure is creating vulnerability, every time an enlisted technician sees a pattern that officers overlook, Kellerman's defiance echoes forward. The system erased him. But the system also carries him forward, embedded in doctrine, invisible but essential. Like the 90-second gap in a Morse transmission, silent, deliberate, and exactly where it needs to be. In the 79 years since March 22, 1944, an estimated 847 books have been published about the Allied air campaign over Europe. Kellerman's name appears in 3 of them, always in footnotes, never in the index. The Tactical Transmission Interval Protocol is still taught in modified form at the Defense Information School at Fort Meade, Maryland. Students learn the principle: disrupt predictable communication patterns to deny adversaries timing intelligence, but not the origin story. Of the 12 P-47 pilots who flew the first successful intercept using Kellerman's procedure, 9 survived the war. They returned home, raised families, and lived into old age. None of them ever learned the name of the radio operator who had waited 90 seconds before transmitting their scramble order. Paul Vickers's grandchildren donated his personal papers to the National Archives in 2004. Among them was a handwritten note dated May 15, 1944, addressed to Kellerman but never sent. It read, "They'll forget us, but they won't forget what we did. That's enough." Lieutenant Harrow, who became Colonel Harrow before retiring in 1962, wrote in his unpublished memoirs, "I spent the war enforcing regulations. Some of those regulations saved lives. Some of them cost lives. Learning the difference was the hardest lesson of command." The SCR 522 radio set that Kellerman operated is now in storage at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum. It has never been displayed. In 2023, researchers using artificial intelligence to analyze declassified World War II radio logs identified a pattern. Starting in late March 1944, Allied intercept transmissions began exhibiting temporal variants consistent with deliberate procedural modification. The AI flagged this as significant, but offered no explanation for why the modification occurred or who implemented it. The answer was there in the archives, buried in personnel files and court-martial records, but the AI couldn't read between the lines. It couldn't see the human cost of innovation, the courage required to defy authority, or the quiet injustice of systems that consume their saviors. That requires something machines don't have: the ability to recognize that history isn't just what happened, it's who made it happen and why, and at what price. James Kellerman made it happen. He paid the price. And for 79 years, almost no one knew. But now you do. And in the strange mathematics of memory, perhaps that's how innovation survives. Not in bronze monuments or official citations, but in stories passed forward, one listener at a time, until the pattern is remembered even when the names are lost. A 90-second pause, a court-martial, 43 German bombers falling from the sky, a corporal's name vanishing into administrative files, and a truth that echoes forward through 8 decades. Real change doesn't come from the top. It comes from the edges, from those who see what others overlook, who act when systems fail, who risk everything for a principle that no one will remember to thank them for. The silent gap in the transmission, the pause that saved lives, the radio operator who dared to wait. History forgot him, but the sky remembers.